That's because I'm busy doing other wildlife things. So yeah, I don't feel so bad. So Vicky and Audrey asked me to give a talk on hedges, primarily to help the wildlife wardens understand how they may be able to assist local landowners and farmers, and to bring everyone up to speed with the most recent government agri-environment scheme grants that have got a new fancy name called Sustainable Farm Incentives, which is all part of something which I'm sure you've all heard of, which is called ELMS. So I started putting a presentation together, and I wanted to have loads of really nice pictures and not very many words. So I went onto the People's Trust for Endangered Species website, because I know they do an awful lot of hedgerow work, and I started to steal a load of the images. And then I suddenly thought, oh, I should probably ask for copyright. So I contacted the PTES and I asked if I could use them. And Megan got in contact with me as the hedgerow officer and said, yes, of course you can, but I've already got a presentation that you may wish to use. And I said, well, rather than reinvent the wheel, why don't you come along and we do a tag team? So that's how comes Megan is here alongside me. So we are going to tag team, and Megan's going to do the majority of the talk, but I'm going to, at the end, focus on the stewardship and agri-environment grant side of things. We'll both be around to talk about questions and things at the end, but I will now hand over to Megan and put myself on mute and let Megan start the presentation, if that's all right.
Fantastic, of course. Right, bear with me for just a second whilst I rework out how to share. Oh. Hopefully you can just see a picture of me in a hedge. Is that what you can see? Fantastic, right. So thank you for that introduction. Yeah, my name's Megan. I work for People's Trust for Endangered Species, where I've been for almost a decade now. And technically I'm the key habitats officer, but really that's 99% hedgerows, because I am, no two ways about it, I am just a massive hedgerow geek. So I'm going to do a bit of a whistle-stop tour of hedges today. I'm going to look at why an endangered species charity are involved in hedges to begin with, why they're so good for wildlife, look at some of the different structures that we find in a hedge and how they matter, and look at a little bit about how hedgerow management affects the health of the hedges, and what we already know about the health of our hedges nationwide. Then do a little bit about the new hedgerow surveying and how that fits into the SFIs, before handing over to Elliot to talk about the new government incentives for managing hedgerows in farms. So that's going to be the brief overview of this. I get quite excited when I'm talking about hedges because they're amazing, but sometimes it means I talk really quickly. If I talk too quickly for you to be able to hear me, just raise your voice and tell me to slow down. I'll happily slow down. So at this point, I should mention that I am a Devon girl. I'm East Devon, and grew up in a part of Devon called Plymtree, in fact, where I'm sat now. And having gone around the country looking and talking about hedges, I think I can safely say that we have the best hedges in the world in Devon, and the Southwest in general, but Devon specifically. I know I chat a lot about hedges in general, but I think, you know, what makes Devon ones so special, I'll get to later. So first, some sad context. There's going to be a couple of sad slides in here, but mostly they'll be optimistic. This is one of the sad ones. We are obviously facing a triple threat: a biodiversity crisis, an environmental crisis, and a climate crisis. The most recent State of Nature report made for really unpleasant reading. And pretty much all the graphs that I care about are still moving in the wrong direction. And what I will say is that hedges aren't going to single-handedly fix all of this. But what I would say is they are a really important tool in our toolkit, and they have the capacity to help on many fronts really rapidly as well. So 70% of the UK is agricultural land. So what we do within them is hugely important for our native wildlife, and hedgerows being probably one of the most important habitats we've got within our farmed landscape. So this is the second of my depressing slides, I'm afraid. This is the downhill trend for farmland bird indicator species between 1970 and 2021. So we've seen more than 55% decline since 1970. But they're still declining now. That decline has slowed, but they are still declining. And I think for context, 84% of the bird species represented in this graph use hedgerows in some way. And sadly, we've seen similar declines with our dormouse populations, which we think we've lost 70% of since the millennium. Similarly, with our hedgehogs, we think we've lost about half of those since the millennium. And we're seeing quite alarming biodiversity losses across the board. So this is where obviously some species and habitat conservation comes in. And with conservation, obviously, we've got two fairly different strategies of how we might go about preserving this wildlife. One is called land sparing, which is the idea that we can set aside land and let nature get on with things like nature reserves, wildlife reserves. And the other one is land sharing. And that's the idea that we can manage land in a way that benefits us, mostly producing food, whilst also supporting wildlife. Now, you've probably noticed in the media, there's quite a lot of debate about this with regards to the benefits of rewilding or regenerative agriculture. Personally, as a girl that enjoys eating, likes food, I do believe that we need some land sharing. We need to be looking at our farmland and making sure that we can produce food and sustain wildlife at the same time. And luckily, when it comes to land sharing, hedges have some really big potential. So why hedges are so good? Why I'm work for an endangered species charity. Why are we involved in hedges? Well, they're pretty much as incredible for wildlife as you can get, to be honest, as a habitat. For the amount of land area they take up, they have an absolutely enormous impact for wildlife. There was a study done by Robert Walton of the Devon Hedge Group, and he looked at one of the hedges on his farm. It was an 85-meter stretch of hedge, and he counted 2,070 different species of animal, insect, plant living and using that hedgerow. 2,070 different species. To put that into context, if you were to look at one species per day, that would take you over 5.5 years. And this was just 85 meters of hedge outside his house on his farm in Devon. So just imagine what they might be able to hold nationwide if we manage them well. So how do hedges do it? That's pretty phenomenal figure. How do they do it? So first of all, they provide a physical home. Birds will nest in there. Dormice might hibernate there or put their breeding sites. We've got all sorts of things from small mammals to bumblebees to birds that physically live within the hedgerow. Next up, what we call a complementary habitat. So things that might not necessarily live within the hedgerow, but they still rely on that hedgerow network, maybe for shelter from predators or shelter from the elements. And also food. You might have heard the phrase nature's larder. Well, hedgerows certainly are that. Not only are they filled with amazing berries and blossom, but actually, they can also be wonderful hunting grounds for like this barn owl, which is one that comes to my orchard in East Devon quite a lot. And thirdly, you might have also heard this phrase as well, they're wildlife corridors. So they connect up other habitats and connect up populations of things that might otherwise be isolated. So these corridors essentially allow many species, things like birds, bats, butterflies, dormice, small mammals, newts, they allow these animals to safely move around the countryside from habitat to habitat, area to area. Really very important. So some species might use a hedge for one of those three things. But loads actually rely on hedges for all of them at once. I think a bat is a really good example of this. Bats need three things to thrive in a habitat. They need a roosting site, a safe commute, and insects to feed on. Now, hedges and hedgerow trees can provide all of this. Bats will often roost in hedgerow trees. They commute because they echolocate along the hedgerows to actually find their way around the countryside. And they will also hoover up any insects that the hedge might have grown in there as well. And not only does the hedge provide the insects that feed the bats, but the hedge also provides the shelter. On a night like tonight, not too many things will be on the wing unless they have somewhere where they're sheltered. So a little bit of shelter from the wind and the rain to make sure that those insects are flying and the bats can be fed. Similarly, hedgehogs will use hedges for all three things. They will nest at the bottom of a hedge, hibernate at the base of a hedge. They'll feed on invertebrates in the hedgerow margins. And they'll also use hedges to help them navigate the landscape. They like to sort of bimble across what we call the linear features, and hedge being, one of the most important linear features for the hedgehogs. And of course, dormice, one of my favourite examples. So dormice use hedges for home, for food, and as corridors. So we normally think of them associated with coppice woodland, especially hazel coppice, but actually hedges can be capable of sustaining breeding populations of these dormice as well. But in order to do that, the hedgerows need to be fairly healthy, they need to be fairly large, and they need to be species rich. And the reason for the species richness is that dormice eat a variety of foods. So, and that changes throughout the year. When they wake up in spring, they might start off by eating blackthorn blossom because of the high protein pollen. Then they'll move on to things like aphids. They might move on to other insects, and then move on to berries, blackberries, before moving on to things like hazelnuts later on in the season. So actually, for a hedge to be able to support a population of dormice, it needs to be good and species rich. Now, this is something we do really well in Devon. We've got fantastic species rich hedgerows, which is why we've also got a really strong complement of dormice. But it's not just about the species that are in there, it's also making sure that they are able to flower and fruit, because that's also key, not just what we've got in there, but how we manage it. So, of course, dormice are also what we call arboreal. They don't like to scamper across the ground. They much prefer travelling across branches. So actually, hedgerows are particularly important for them to be able to move between different other woodlands where they might also have populations. And this way of linking up these populations of dormice is so important for their conservation, because any population that becomes isolated is much more vulnerable. So how do they do it? I mean, hedges, let's be honest, hedges are a man-made habitat. So how are they this good for wildlife? At the end of the day, we're not hugely well known for creating things that are good for wildlife. And I'd say that the short version of this is that hedges mimic the rich habitat that we find at a woodland edge. So they've got overlapping elements of woodland with their trees, flowering scrub with that wonderful scrubby tusky bits, and the grazed pasture with their wonderful margins. So not only does that mean they're capable of supporting many species of each of those different habitats, for example, 80% of what we would normally call woodland bird species will also use hedgerows. But actually, it turns out there's quite a lot of wildlife that thrive in this particular combination of features. So actually things that need all of those elements to be there to actually fulfill their life cycles. And the closer you look at our native ecology, the more species you find thrive in this woodland edge ecotone. And the reason for that, I'm going off on a bit of a tangent here, but bear with me. The reason for that is that this is a similar combination of features to what we would have seen in pre-agricultural wildwood. And that's what our ecology adapted to in the UK. So, unlike what we were taught in school, it wasn't just closed canopy woodland from coast to coast. There's actually quite a lot of evidence to suggest it was much more of a mosaic of successionary habitat. And by this, I mean habitat at different stages of growth, dynamic landscape that was sort of constantly in motion as the sort of big grazing herbivores and browsing herbivores moved around the countryside, crashing and crunching and knocking things over and browsing. So there would have been patches of woodland, probably a lot more than we had now, but there would have also been glades, there would have been areas of scrub, there would have been pasture, there would be scattered trees with those big, wonderful open canopies. There would have been no sort of harsh dividing line between woodland and pasture. So actually we would have had much more of this sort of woodland edge ecotone with this kind of structural combination. And again, if it was this sort of dynamic edge habitat that our wildlife adapted to, then I think that goes quite a long way in explaining how and why cultural woodland edge habitats, such as hedges, traditional orchards, and wood pastures, are also so very rich in wildlife, even though they are technically man-made habitats. So for hedges, all we've done really is we've squeezed this amazing habitat into narrow corridors. So we've lost that spatial dynamism. We don't let them romp into our fields anymore. As I said earlier, I'm fond of eating, so we do need to be growing things within some of our fields. And because we've lost some of that spatial dynamism, we need to make sure that we maintain that sort of succession and that dynamic approach to hedge habitat through the way we manage them over time. And what this really means is managing them on a life cycle. So conveniently, managing hedges on their natural life cycle is no new thing. That's actually what we've been practicing for centuries. And this is managing them. We keep their dynamism. We reset the hedge succession when they mature out of that Goldilocks stage of growth. And we end up creating a habitat that's both useful to us as a feature in our farmland, but is also absolute ecological dynamite for our wildlife. So I hope I didn't do too much of a deviation there. I'm gonna now run through what we think a good hedgerow looks like and the different structural elements of a hedge. So first of all, I would say, as I did earlier with dormice, a mix of different plant species is really good. So hedges with more plant species have a higher diversity of invertebrates and birds. And partly that's because each plant will have a thing that specializes on feeding on it. But it also means that you get a better year-round availability of food. So they all flower and they all fruit at slightly different times. So if you've got a good old mix of species in there, you're going to have a longer period for which your hedge flowers and fruits. Next up, the size of a hedge is also important. So generally, bigger hedges, higher and wider hedges, increase the diversity and abundance of wildlife within them. And that's not just because they're bigger, so there's more habitat by volume, but also because it increases the complexity of the habitat. You've got more different weird niches inside there. And that complexity provides better shelter for foraging birds, reduced predation for nesting birds. So really very important. But what I would say with this is, again, back to my point about dynamism, hedges have to be dynamic to keep this wonderful vitality. So we can't have a perfect hedge height and width, because the perfect hedge height and width is always changing. So if anyone asks me what the best hedge is, I generally have to say bigger than it was last year, or bigger on average within its life cycle. Next up, we want structural complexity. So some species need several different hedge features throughout their life cycle. A good example of this, I think, is the song thrush. So a song thrush will sing and mark its territory from hedgerow trees. It will nest in the sort of protected, dense scrubbiness of the hedgerow itself. It will feed on invertebrates from the hedge base, and then it will move back onto the hedge for feeding when the berries come out later in the year. So they need all of those different elements to really satisfy their life cycle. But you can take that a step further as well. And actually, you can say that given we have different species that have slightly different needs and preferences from a hedge, ideally, we want to see hedges of different structures represented across the landscape at any one time. We don't want them all big and bushy. We don't want them all small and trim. We want a combination at any one time. And luckily, this is what you get as a consequence of managing them on a life cycle. If you manage all of your hedges on a life cycle and you stagger them, then you will always have this wonderful structural complexity across the board. You'll always have some that have just been trimmed, just been rejuvenated, some that are bigger, wild and woolly, as a natural byproduct of managing hedges on that cycle. Next up, with hedge structure, we want to look at connectivity. So this isn't just connectivity within a hedge. I'm sure you're aware that some hedges have got increasingly gappy over the years, but also connectivity to other habitats. So whether we're connecting up little woodlands or copses or ponds or rivers or streams, it's really very important for the creatures that live in those other habitats to have these safe connections to move across the countryside. Next up, a margin. Now, this is a little bit different in Devon because we've also got hedge banks, but this is very, very important. So they do two things. First of all, they're important for the wildlife within them. So the tussocky grasses, the wildflowers, all of that sort of stuff is fantastic for birds, for insects, for wildlife in general. In fact, over 40% of the priority species that live in our hedges use those margins. But what those margins can also do, and I'll include banks in this bit, is what those margins can also do is protect the roots of our hedges. If we ploughed right up close to our hedges, what we'll be doing is churning up those roots and making those hedges more, well, they'll be more at threat. It might not kill them outright, but maybe the next drought that we get, or maybe the next hedge tree disease, it puts them at a weakness. So the margin protects the roots, which protects the structure of the hedge itself. Next up, we want to see density all the way down to the ground, because density to the ground in a hedge is crucially important. So this is, think shelter for hedgehogs, think insects, think reptiles, small mammals that need the protection of that hedge base. Even some nesting birds. There are some birds that like to nest at knee height. So if your hedge doesn't have a knee height, then they've lost their favourite nesting place. But unfortunately, the density to the base of your hedge can grow thin. So the top left example on this screen, that's a hedge that's been trimmed too much at the same height. And we've got that sort of tabletop structure with no growth at the bottom level. The one below that, that's been nibbled by sheep, because sheep have gone in and eaten from the base up. And the two on the right, that's what we want to see. We want to see hedges that the bases go all the way down to the ground. And lastly, for hedgerow structures, I want to give a shout out to hedgerow trees. And again, this is something we do fantastically in Devon. When I'm giving talks around the country, people always say, oh, you can't have hedgerow trees, it's going to punch holes in your hedges. And I said, well, come down to Devon, because we've got hedgerow trees aplenty, and we're managing fine. Hedge trees are crucially important for the hedge habitat. So over half the priority species that are associated with our hedges depend on hedgerow trees being there. So not only are they songposts, territory markers for birds, also additional nesting opportunities for birds, bats, insects, and more. But actually, when you think of it, if a hedgerow has been cut, then it's not going to blossom and fruit, generally. But the tree above it will. So depending on what species you've got in your hedgerow trees, it's providing a buffer. So it will flower and it will fruit, irrespective of how the hedgerow below is being managed. So that gives us a really good wildlife buffer. And old hedge trees, I mean, all of these hedge trees are within walking distance of my house down in East Devon. So these are old pollard trees. And actually, we've got lots and lots of amazing pollard trees in Devon, partly because we got coal so late, so we were working our tree resources for longer. But these are absolute wildlife powerhouses. They have this incredible, intricate habitat within them, deadwood dependent species. So we've got about 2,000 different deadwood dependent insects living in this country. 2,000. We don't know much about them because they hide away in the centre of big old trees like this. But we do know that at least 320 of those are pollinators. So it's an important group. And actually, we call them saprophytic invertebrates. They're some of our most rare, because these trees, these wonderful veteran trees, are becoming more and more rare. And sadly, speaking of more and more rare, so are our hedgerow trees becoming. So these two images are of the same piece of land. On the left, that's 1880s, and each one of those dots is a mature hedgerow tree. And you can see the aerial imagery on the right shows that they are pretty much all gone. I think you've only got about 5 trees left in that snip. Now, we've lost trees for many reasons. So first of all, Dutch elm disease. Now we're losing loads to ash dieback, and ash is one of our most popular hedgerow trees, joint only with oak. And to be honest, we haven't been letting our hedgerows establish new hedgerow trees, just because of the way that we've been managing them over the last sort of 50 or so years. So not only have we lost loads, but we haven't been recruiting new ones as well. So we're in a bit of a tricky situation when it comes to hedgerow trees. And if you ask me, tree planting is all the rage. People want to be planting trees everywhere. I would say establishing hedgerow trees, putting those trees in hedges, is a no-brainer. It doesn't take any more land out of crop production. They form open-grown trees, which have huge wildlife benefits. We know it improves the hedgerow habitat, and the hedgerow habitat is currently lacking in hedgerow trees as well. So we'd certainly be improving the hedges for wildlife as well. but they can also be really flexible. We can manage them for timber, wood fuel, crop. We can coppice them, pollard them, or leave them as standards. We can choose small tree species if we don't want to shade out the field to the north. So, or we could put them in our east-west hedges. And we could put the larger trees, our big old oaks and our ashes and our beeches. Those can go in the north-south hedges, where they're not going to shade out the field in between, but they might have added benefits of wind protection. And actually, we don't even need to buy these trees. We can use natural regeneration techniques to create them from the hedges themselves. Two ways of doing this. The first way is to put tags on young hedgerow trees that look decent, and then just don't trim them. I know that Fwag Southwest, and I think Devon Wildlife Trust have some wonderful bright orange tags that you can tag young hedgerow trees with. But another way of doing it is actually, as this photo shows, is when we next lay that hedge, we just leave a couple of decent stems standing. And by magic, there we have it. We've already got a new hedgerow tree. And doing it through natural regeneration, I would say, is absolutely the best way to do it, because this has the added benefit of preserving the genetic diversity in our local tree populations. So genetic diversity, we know, is going to be a crucial defense of any tree population against the unknown threats of climate change. So, you know, one tree might be naturally better in drought, another might be naturally resistant to floods, or maybe a third might have natural resistance to whatever new tree disease might be around the corner. So from my perspective, preserving the genetic diversity we've already got within our hedges is really important. We don't need to plant, we've got them already there. But of course, we can also plant trees. Call me an optimist whenever I see a gap in a hedge. I think that's a great opportunity to plant a hedgerow tree. And we can also use tree planting within our hedges to increase the number of species within our hedge. This photo here shows a hawthorn single species hedge. This one was actually in the Midlands. And it would be great to put a few more species in there, whether we put them in the hedge themselves or put them in as hedgerow trees. And when I said about that hedge being from the Midlands, so the origin story of a hedge can have a huge impact on the structures within it, but also the wildlife that you might find, because not all hedgerows were born equal. So the Midlands hedges, and the ones that many people think of when they think of hedges, are the ones that we planted in the enclosures. The Enclosures Act, you know, a couple of 100 years ago, where we basically sort of fenced off land and put hedges there. They tend to be single species hawthorn hedges. A few areas like Shropshire have a few multi-species ones, but they tend to be fairly low diversity. What we've got down here is totally different. So those enclosure hedges only account for less than half of our hedges nationwide. The rest of our hedges are older. Now, Cornwall has some hedges that some people believe are up to 5, maybe even 6,000 years old. Dartmoor has Bronze Age hedges still there. We've got maps that show individual named hedges in the same place for about 1,000 years that are still there. Many of our hedges, what we call assart hedges, they were actually created by leaving strips of the wildwood when we literally cut out our fields from that pre-agricultural wildwood. So those ones are literally remnants of the pre-agricultural wildwood. So when you think about it, it's no surprise that hedges like this are chock full of ancient woodland indicator species, full of plants, full of fungi, and home to like a huge proportion of the genetic diversity of our tree and shrub population. So those old and ancient hedges are absolutely to be protected at all costs, I would say. And when it comes to Devon, you know, we've got these fantastic ancient hedges on Devon hedge banks. Most of them, 2/3 of them, it's believed, are medieval or older in Devon. So really, really valuable set of resources that we've got down here. So, of course, it's not just wildlife that benefit from hedges, but we are becoming increasingly aware how valuable they are in our battle against climate change, but also within our farming as well. So I'm going to whittle through this one quite quickly. This is a poster that I wanted to call "What Have Hedgerows Ever Done for Us?" But I was told that not everyone would get the joke, so I had to call it "The Benefits of Healthy Hedgerows," which is a little bit more dry. Anyway, we'll start with livestock, because we're a fairly livestock heavy area down here. So hedges provide really valuable shelter. Now, this is really key for for body condition, health and welfare of animals, particularly cattle and lambs, especially in those spring storms that we get increasing numbers of. Equally, shade. We're getting long, hot heat waves at the moment. Obviously not at the moment, but increasingly as time goes on with climate change. And having shade is incredibly valuable to them. Also, wind protection. That comes in with shelter, but we've also got things like diet diversity. You know, cows aren't just grass-eating creatures. You turn them out into a field full of fresh pasture, and you know some of them are going to go straight to the hedge, because actually the hedge provides a diverse browse for them. It's not just the grass. And all of this is really, really important to actually reach our high animal welfare standards, as well as for rearing healthy and profitable livestock. So if you're not interested in livestock, if you're growing crops, then they can benefit crops too. So this diagram here shows a hedgerow as a windbreak. So what they do is they actually filter out the strength of the wind without creating turbulence on the leeward side. And they have the potential to produce shelter from the wind up to 12 times the height of the hedge into the field. So if your hedge was 2 meters high, you get 24 meters of shelter within that field. So really, really very, very valuable. They can help us reduce our pesticide use by providing insects that will come into the field and predate on those pests. So things like predatory spiders, parasitic wasps, hoverflies, ground beetles, all sorts of things that will live in the hedgerows and then commute into the fields to eat the pests. Now, what they're not going to do is stop us needing to do anything else. But what it can do is slow that boom of species that pest species that we can get. Similarly, our pollinator species, our diverse pollinator species, need somewhere to live. Now, most of our pollinator species need an area of uncropped land to live in, and within the farming arena, hedges are the best place because there's a diverse set of niches that they can call home. So that might be their summer nests or even their overwintering sites. And on top of that, you know, our hedges are what feed our pollinator populations whilst our crops aren't in flower. So they make sure that our pollinators have enough food to sustain their populations throughout the whole season. Hedges can also reduce soil erosion. They can help in times of flood by increasing the rate at which water infiltrates into soil. They soak up pollution. They also soak up carbon. Now, this one's being, again, increasingly realised how much carbon they soak up. And we don't have all the answers yet. There's a lot of research going on at the moment, but we certainly don't have all the answers. But I know they're the topic of some quite large plans in terms of hedge planting and hedge establishment for climate change in particular. And then, of course, what I'd say as a Devon girl is there's a whole load of things that hedges do for us that aren't as quantifiable as all of this. I would say, you know, they tell a story. They tell a story of our history. They're hugely, hugely important when we're looking at, you know, tourism, our privacy, our sense of place, and sort of defining feature of our countryside. Every time I go up a hill, I look around and I just say, what can I even imagine what this would look like without our hedgerows? And generally, it's, you know, I can't I can't imagine Devon without its hedgerows and its hedgerow trees. So how we manage our hedges really affects their health. So some hedges are in better shape than others, and the management they see has a huge impact on their capacity to sustain wildlife, and also their capacity to do all of those other benefits. You know, the hedgerow in this picture here certainly isn't going to be doing all of those wonderful things for us as landowners or for wildlife. You know, this hedgerow here, this one was actually down in Kent. This isn't a wildlife corridor. This isn't a wildlife larder. This isn't a home, but this isn't also sequestering carbon or reducing soil erosion. This isn't doing any of the benefits that it could be. So whilst that might sound like a negative comment, what I see this as is an opportunity. We have an opportunity to improve the hedgerow network that we already have to make sure that it can fulfill all of those wonderful roles that it can do for us. So I think it's no secret that we went through a few dark decades with our hedges. There was government incentivised hedgerow removal post-war, and we think we lost up to about 50% of our hedges. At the time, we thought this was in the national interest. I'm glad that we've changed our minds, and we've actually started putting much more hedges back in. So this graph actually shows the recent uptick in hedgerow planting. So those two last columns, those two columns that tower above the rest, they were the hedgerow planting of 2021 and 2022 seasons. So really, really has massively increased how much we're planting hedges. And actually, this has come after a lot of recommendations. So the Interparliamentary Panel for Climate Change recommended that we need to increase our hedge extent by 40% to help reduce climate change. Now that equates to about 200,000 kilometres of new hedge, which is enormous. Now the government have taken this on board. They haven't been quite that ambitious, but they have set a target of 45,000 miles, which is about 72,000 kilometres, to plant by 2050, which is still a heck of a lot of hedge. So 45,000 miles of new hedge. Now, despite that recent uptick in planting rates, we're not really close to planting at that rate that we'll achieve this yet. But what I would say is we have a number of opportunities within this. So before now, we've mostly been managing hedges that we inherited, hedges that suited the needs of our forebears, the ones that established them. But this time round, we get to choose what the main purpose of these hedges are, and then we get to plant them and managing them according to our modern needs. So I would say wildlife can be up there as one of the objectives that our modern hedges can be designed around. So that means we can choose where these new hedges go, prioritise planting hedges that connect up other habitat maybe. We can choose what species go in them. We don't have to plant for single species hawthorn hedging. We can plant amazing mixed species hedges that fit well in this part of the world. And these hedges, these mixed species hedges, will be much better at catering for the dietary requirements of our wildlife, and also providing a backup plan. They're much more robust. Sometimes one species will have an off year and it won't blossom or it won't fruit. But if you have a mixed species hedges, others will and take up that mantle. Or goodness forbid, if we have a new hedgerow tree disease, you know, if that takes out only 1/8 of our hedge planting, that's much better than taking out the whole lot. So certainly there's an idea of mixed species being more robust, better for wildlife and more robust in the face of climate change. What I would say, with this wild enthusiasm for new hedgerows, it's worth remembering that what we have now shouldn't be considered a baseline, and that new hedges don't adequately replace the value of old ones. We can't replace the value of the lost old hedges, especially those old ancient assart hedges that are chock full of all that diversity. So from my perspective, managing our existing hedgerows is more important than anything. So obviously we're no longer being paid to remove hedges. In fact, now there's regulation that prohibits it, and we're now putting lots of hedges back in. But unfortunately, the statistics show that we are still losing some of our old hedges, largely through the way that we're managing them. We have stepped away from managing them on their inherent life cycle, and that basically means that their structure struggles. It will decline, and slowly they are fading. So what I'm going to quickly do, if that's okay, is run through what we think good hedge management looks like. So I'm going to start from the right beginning. Planting a new hedge. There's more to establishing a hedge than planting it. Now, I see a way, there's 3 good ways of establishing a hedge. Number 1, you've planted your hedge, you leave it to grow for 10-ish years, maybe 15, then you lay it. When you lay it, what you essentially do is you make a cut right at the bottom and bend over that top stuff. What you get from the bottom is a whole load of new shoots, which is amazing. That creates a much thicker, denser hedge right from that base. Much better for wildlife, much better for the hedge long term. It's also a really good opportunity to take away those spiral guards, because it's never a good opportunity otherwise. And it really, really does create a really good thick hedge. And it takes away that spiral shadow as well, where the spiral guard has been, there's often less branching at the bottom. So it can remove that. From that point, we can then trim this hedge slightly higher and slightly wider each year to create a really decent, thick, dense hedge. Now that to me is gold standard, A-star, best hedge establishment method we've got. Option 2 is very similar, except instead of laying it, we coppice it and then incrementally trim it. And option 3 for good hedge establishment is we just incrementally trim it higher and wider from the start. Now, this is really good in some ways because it creates that branching density. A hedge will generally put on branching growth just below where you cut it. So if you cut it at a different place each year, it's going to put on branching growth right from the bottom to the top. It's not quite as good as the top method because it hasn't been through that rejuvenation, which means you've still only got your 5 or 6 whips to the meter. You haven't created wonderful multi-stemmed shrubs. And likelihood is there's still got its spiral tubes on because, as I said, there is never a good opportunity to remove those. So this is a hedge. This one's 12 years old, and this was planted and managed in that first method with that leave it, lay it, and then incremental trim it. And it's beautiful. What a wonderful hedge. Now, what we don't want to see is, unfortunately, what we have seen over the last 20 years, because, unfortunately, the government started giving out hedgerow grants, but didn't give out any advice about what to do with them. So what we don't want to see is hedges left to grow to the height that we want them eventually and just keep trimming them there. Because, as I said, hedgerows will put on branching growth just below where we cut them. So if we cut them in the same place each time, that's going to be the only place they put on growth. So they're going to be top heavy, they're going to have this knuckle at the trim line, and they're going to start elbowing each other out as well. So that doesn't produce a good hedge. In fact, this hedge is the same age as that other one that I showed you, and you can see the difference. This one, has already lost stems. It's still got its spirals on, and it's already looking incredibly scrappy. So how we establish hedges has a massive effect on what they turn out to be like. So once we've got an established hedge, what I would say is they do require management. We do need to manage them. And this might mean trimming, this might mean laying, or it might mean, as I prefer, a combination of the two. So if we don't manage them at all, they race up to the sky and they become a line of trees. Now, what a mixed species hedge will do is all of the bigger, beefier ones will outshade the smaller, slower growing and scrubbier ones. So things like hawthorn and blackthorn will get shaded out and we'll lose those. Next up, they're planted so close together that they're never all going to become full trees. So what they end up actually doing is elbowing each other out, competing for light, racing up, elbowing each other out, and becoming increasingly gappy, at which point we lose our connectivity as well. So it really, really does struggle. So we do need to do some form of management, and generally we can utilize trimming to do this. So understanding how trimming affects a hedge is really very valuable. So when we cut off, as many gardeners will know, when you cut off the growing tips of a plant, what it tends to do instead, that changes the balance of hormones within your plants. And instead of the race to the sky, cutting off those growing tips means it puts effort into branching growth. So imagine if you've cut off the growing tips, it puts on branching growth, then you cut off the growing tips slightly higher, slightly wider, slightly higher, slightly wider. You end up creating this wonderful, dense branching structure. So we can utilize this response that our plants inherently have to create a really dense, great hedge that's fantastic shelter and nesting habitat. Unfortunately, this goes wrong when people cut their hedges to the same point and cut them every single year. So those two things combined do some real damage. Not only will this reduce the value of the hedges to wildlife, but actually it also threatens the structure of the hedge itself. So it will lose density at the base, it'll start elbowing each other out, the individual plants get stressed and are lost, and we end up with increasingly gappy hedges. And sadly, we're seeing this play out in real time. As hedges are trimmed to the same point every year, we are losing stems and they are becoming more and more gappy, and many hedges are just fading from the countryside. So I believe that was my last depressing slide, you'll be pleased to hear. So what can we do? What can we do to avoid that? So I would say there's two main things we can do if we want flowers and fruit. One, knowing that plants blossom and fruit on young wood, second year wood and older, gives us two options. if we want to see them flowering and fruiting. So one of them is longer trimming rotations. Now, this one's been in countryside stewardship for years, you know, cutting every other year or cutting every third year. And this series of photographs shows just how good that can be for a hedgerow blossom. And of course, hedgerow blossom leads to hedgerow fruit. Even if you had a hugely diverse mixed species hedge, if you cut it to the same point every single year, you cut off its flowering and fruiting potential, so massively reducing how good it is for wildlife. The other option is what we call incremental trimming, and this is just cutting it higher and wider at each trim. So this is a really simple tweak to the way we can manage our hedges that can have instant results. So the advantages of this are numerous. First of all, you've always got a border of young wood around your hedge. So your hedge will always have flowering wood and fruiting wood. So it will always flower and fruit each spring and summer. Second of all, you're not doing that structural damage. You're creating the density without creating those, we call them the knuckle, those sort of scar points at the trim line. But what we're also doing is changing our mindsets in a way that we allow those hedges to grow and expand and change through time. And I think that's going to be crucial. And the results, I think, speak for themselves. This is a hedge that's trimmed every single year, but it's just trimmed slightly higher and slightly wider. So this is achievable under annual trimming, and I think it's wildly exciting. And then, of course, sometimes with our hedges, it's best to when they get to a certain stage to just leave them go for a while. Just let them do what they want to do, to grow out, to get a bit blousy, get a bit big, before they need to move on to the next point in their life cycle, which is rejuvenation. So what I would say, and this is probably the most important thing in my whole talk, is that it doesn't matter how well you manage your hedge. At some point, it will need rejuvenation. Now, this could be laying or coppicing. But what this does is it resets that hedgerow cycle. It thickens them back up right from the base, and it starts the whole process again. And this is essentially what immortalizes our hedges. No hedgerow plant itself is immortal, but as soon as we go through those cycles and do a rejuvenation, it gives it another life cycle. So it's the regrowth that you get from the base, from that cut stall, which essentially acts like a coppice. That's the next generation of hedge coming through there. So not only does it reset the succession and put it back through its cycle, which is great for us and great for wildlife, but it actually turns what would be a hedge with a limited lifespan into something that can actually feasibly live forever. And what I'd say is, when we think about our ancient hedges, 2/3 of our Devon hedges being medieval or older, the only reason we've still got those hedges, none of the plants inside them are that old. The only reason we've still got them is that all of those hedgerows have seen an unbroken chain of care. Every generation, once a generation or so, that hedge has been laid or coppiced, and that's the reason we've still got it. So it's relied on the skills and the management that's been passed down from farmer to farmer, from hedge layer to hedge layer, generation to generation. And we are now at a point where we're overdue rejuvenating our hedges. And they will only survive if we continue to give them this similar care and consideration. So if you put all of that together, that's quite a lot of information I've just thrown at you. This is what you get. So this is what we call the hedge management life cycle. It's based on the work of Nigel Adams and the Adams Code to looking at different hedge structures. I will slim it down a little bit. So this is what we want to see. We want to see hedges rejuvenated through laying or coppicing, then put into trimming regimes. Trimming slows down the need for further rejuvenation, so it extends that period of time. So trimming might be rotational every 2 or 3 years, or it could be incremental. And it might then see a period of time where we just let it grow in what we call non-intervention. And then it gets rejuvenated and goes round and cycles again. And it can endlessly go round that cycle there, endlessly. This is what happens if it spins out of that cycle and we stop managing them. They eventually turn into lines of trees, lose their scrubby structure, become increasingly gappy, are eventually lost. We can actually recover those in most of the cases, either through laying, or if they've got a bit too big, through coppicing. This is what happens if you spin out on the other end of the cycle. If you trim your hedge too frequently at the same height, you end up getting what we call over-trimmed hedges with this the growth at the top and not so much density at the bottom, then they get stressed out, they get gappy, they get increasingly gappy and can be lost. And again, we can recover almost all of these through either letting up and laying or through coppicing and replanting the gaps. So what I love about this diagram is it shows that it doesn't matter what stage your hedgerow is currently in. There is a garish pink box in purple arrow that can give you a management advice that will get your hedgerow back into that healthy cycle. And once we've got all of those back into the healthy cycle, we can cycle them all again from there. I've got a few examples. So this is a hedgerow. This is a hazel hedgerow that was coppiced. The brash was used as a dead hedge right next to it to maintain that connectivity. And that picture at the bottom, that's just 1 year's regrowth. So really, really very fast. It is amazing how quickly they come back from rejuvenation. This was an over-trimmed hedge that was let up, so for about 4 years to grow up, to get to a good point, and then laid. And this was an over-trimmed hedge as well. You can see what a terrible structure that had got into, that again was let to grow up for a few years and then laid. Now they grow back fantastically fast. This is 1 year's growth after this hedge was coppiced. This hedge was only 5 years ago laid, and it's absolutely looking spectacular. And here we've got my CEO. We did some hedge laying on one of our nature reserves. We found this scrappy hedge. It was a bit overstood, and it was even scrappier once we cleared out all the deadwood and the bramble and the ivy in preparation to lay. But then we planted up a couple of gaps. We laid this hedge, and within a growing season and a growing season and a half, it's looking absolutely splendid again. And this is what it's looking like now. So really, really fantastic. So what I'm saying with this management cycle is it's not reinventing the wheel. This is traditional hedge management. This is exactly what traditional hedge management has always been. So where we deviated from traditional hedge management was when we got the flail. Now, I'm not a flail hater. I think they're fantastic tools if used well, but we don't need to use them as intensively as we do. So we can use traditional knowledge and modern tools and combine them to create an approach that's actually really valuable for hedges. So when we learn to speak hedge, there's actually a lot of clues that they give us when we learn to speak their language. We can see things like the knuckle, the scar knuckle at the trim line. We can see when they start to turn a bit beanpoley or sticky, where they get high base canopies or where they get hummocks of elder invading into them, or low stem density or gaps or ivy at the trim line. All of these things are clues that our hedges are struggling and need a new approach. So again, I've thrown a lot of information at you about hedgerow management, and I think it's fair to say it can be quite a complex issue. So what we've done to try and help that is over one of the lockdowns, I taught myself how to code and created an app. And this app basically has all of that information in, and it's designed specifically for farmers and land managers to help understand how to transition back to this traditional rotational management. So the app is called Healthy Hedgerows and it's totally free. The whole idea is that it's quick and simple to use. It's only 6 questions long. And within 6 questions, it will understand where a hedge is within its life cycle and what management would best suit it going forward. So for the Healthy Hedgerows app, there's 6 questions. So they're either multiple choice or they're really simple questions like which hedge structure is it? How high is it? How wide is it? How many what length of gap is there and how many trees? That sort of thing. So I'm going to give a quick run through of how this works. So first of all, you can save an offline map because let's be honest, with the best will in the world, half of Devon doesn't have reception when you're out in the field. So you can save an offline map when you're in a house with Wi-Fi or whatnot to use out in the field. Then you can download a map area and then you can get out surveying. So you zoom into the area you're going to survey and then you just press the screen at 2 points at the beginning and the end of the hedge that you want to survey. Then you answer the questions. So the first one is which structural image does your hedge best represents your hedge? It will then give you a description of the one that you've chosen so that you can check that you've chosen the right one or choose a different one if you will. Then you answer the questions. So how tall is it? How wide is it? How many gaps? What's the base canopy? And how many hedgerow trees have you got? And instantly the algorithms within the app will work out what management advice best suits that hedge going forward. The idea with this is that you will be standing still in front of that hedge, looking at your hedge whilst getting this management advice that will then help piece together. You can piece all of these together to create a management plan at the farm scale. So the app then puts all of these results onto a map, color codes them for the ones that need most attention and the ones that need the least attention. And the idea behind this is that it's a way of helping farmers, because it's not easy. You know, managing 1 or 2 hedges is okay, but if you've got an entire farm to manage, it's not easy. So this is trying to put it together onto a map where they can actually piece it all together and create a farm scale management plan. There's an old adage that says you can't improve what you're not measuring, and I'd go by that. And this survey basically is designed to help hedges one by demystifying the hedge management that I've just been speaking about. So I think at this point, I probably should stop talking and let Elliot have a talk. So what I will do, shall I stop sharing, or shall I just carry on with this and you take over, Elliot?
Yeah, if you can carry on, and as I just asked you to do the next slide, just press it whenever you're ready, as long as everyone can still hear me.
Yep.
Yep, okay. Yeah, thank you for that. I could listen to that all day long, again and again and again. So yeah, so Megan's kind of talked about why hedges are important, how they've come about ecologically, what species things use them, the structure and what's important, why we are in the situation that we're in with hedges, and as she just said about measuring being an important thing, we now, we've got science to back up the pretty dire situation that some parts of the country are in. And, again, like Megan, I live in Devon, so I'm blessed to be surrounded by hedges. But when I go and see my brother who lives in Peterborough, it's painful. There aren't any hedges, and it is just empty. And yeah, efforts are now being made by current government, and future governments, I'm sure, will continue to try and reverse this. Now, we used to be in the EU, then Brexit happened. That's the only time I'm going to mention it. And when we left, we exited what was called the Common Agricultural Policy. Now, when we were in the CAP, the Common Agricultural Policy, the EU gave farmers money if they owned land. Now, you just needed to own land. Didn't matter what you did on it, didn't matter if you grew food, didn't matter if you had horses, didn't matter if you just let it go long, or it was a wildlife reserve. You got money to have land. Now we've left the EU, the independent UK governments are each choosing how they are going to change what they do with that money. The English government have decided to go down a scheme that I'm sure most of you have heard of, and it's a scheme that's called ELMS, which stands for the Environmental Land Management Scheme. And it's just a fancy word for a load of codes and specifications that go with those codes, and money that goes with those specifications to encourage farmers to try and manage their land in certain ways. And the main English focus is going to be that rather than just being given money for owning land, the English government will only give landowners money if they are seen to do something with that land that serves public goods. And there are 4 main focuses of that. One is to improve air quality. One is to reduce flood alleviation or to increase flood resilience. One is to sequester carbon, and one is to improve biodiversity. And I think that hedges tick absolutely every single one of those boxes. So there's many things that farmers can do that only work on one of those boxes, but hedges work on all of them. They sequester carbon when they grow. The better health the hedge, the better it is for biodiversity. A big hedge will trap water, it will slow surface water across the surface, and it will increase filtration into the soil. And with more trees and more leaves, you're going to have better air quality and pollution soaked up. So to me, hedges are, you know, they are the win-win-win-win of landscape conservation. So with elms, the government have started to introduce what their new funding scheme is called, and it is called SFIs, and that is a sustainable farming incentive. And they have acronyms for all these things, but this current new one is called SFIs. And they've got, I think it's about 16 out at the moment, 16 different SFIs for different things such as nutrient plans or hedgerow plans or soil plans. They're releasing another 90 this summer, and they're talking about another 70 next year. So each year there are more and more coming on. And that's great because it means that there's going to be more money available for things that are good for the environment. But it's kind of confusing because it's very drip, 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 drip. So it's hard for people to keep up to date with things when they're constantly changing. But the good news is, because of hedgerows are so important, they went out with the first tranche of SFI incentives that were released last year, and they've just been updated and improved this year. So if you can do the next slide, Megan. Where have we gone? So before the SFIs, any landowner that wanted to receive a payment for their hedges, they had to enter it into something called BE3. Now the BE doesn't stand for anything, but that was BE3, and what that aimed to basically stop you cutting your hedge every year. It meant that you could cut it every other year, or ideally every third year, or even better, never at all. And the farmers just got a set payment, and that was the only option that ever existed for hedges. The new ones they've brought in, the first one is this HRW1, and really it's like Megan was saying, that information and knowledge about our hedges is really important, because we can kind of become blind to the fact that they're everywhere, and you don't really notice very subtle gradual changes and decline in health if you're seeing it all the time. Whereas if somebody comes in and does almost like a baseline snapshot audit of your entire hedge and scores it and gives you an idea, you can look at that and go, oh, wow, I hadn't really noticed actually that is getting a bit too tall, or wow, that is getting a bit gappy. So one of the schemes is this HRW1, and it's a payment that's going to be made available to farmers if they carry out a hedgerow condition assessment. Now, they will be paid £5 per 100 metres per side of hedge. So if you've got two fields, 100 metres long, and you've got one hedge that separates them, you're going to get £5 for one side and £5 for the other. It's not very much, but the thing is, when you start having a lot of hedges, they do add up in terms of meters turns into kilometers, and pounds turns into hundreds of pounds quite quickly. If you can do the next slide. Now, the aim of that one is to provide a baseline and to get an idea of the hedgerow condition. And ideally, if that plan can then can signpost the farmer or the landowner what needs to be done to make that hedgerow better for air pollution, carbon, biodiversity, or flooding, then that then gives the farmer or landowner a plan, a map, and a list of actions. Now, ideally, they will then go on to happily deliver all of those actions, and everything will be fantastic. They might just put the plan on the shelf. They might, which I suspect is probably do some of them, but not do all of them. But that's better than not doing anything at the moment. Now, Megan talked about the Healthy Hedgerows app, and it's amazing. I'm not saying that I'm not sponsoring them. I use it. I was out on a farm on Tuesday, mapping all of their fields because they've asked me to do their SFI applications, and I've produced all the coloured lines, and it's really interesting because you've got all these blue lines and these red lines and very few green lines, and it's the green lines that we really want. And I'll be using that to feed in, and I'll be writing a hedgerow management plan for the farmer. Now, once they've got that hedgerow management plan, they can then claim that £3 per 100 metres per side of their hedge. And they can claim that in year one and for the next following 2 years. So it's a 3-year grant that they will be able to claim it. It's not a huge amount of money, but when you bear in mind that farmers are losing the money that they have previously received from the EU, which is called single farm payment, which was an annual payment paid to them, they're losing that, and they've got 3 more years left of that, and then that's going to go. And that payment really is what keeps a lot of farms and farmers and farming. It keeps the budgets balanced. And personally, I think there is a big train crash coming if farmers don't look at how they can plug the gap that's going to be created by the drop off of their single farm payment. And I think all these SFI actions and countryside stewardship and things like that the farmers haven't traditionally gone for, I think we're going to see a lot more farmers going into this because they will need to balance their financial books. So, I mean, Megan talked about the Hedgerow map, the Hedgerow app, sorry. So I won't go over that again. So if you can do the next slide. So with the Hedgerow management plan, it doesn't say how, there's no pro forma for what a Hedgerow management plan looks like. There's no, it doesn't have to look like this, or it doesn't have to include this or that. What the actual official guidance says is, it's up to you how to complete this action, as long as you do it in a way that could reasonably be expected to achieve this action's aim. Now, if you Google Hedgerow management plan, you'll see one version that's just a spreadsheet with a load of numbers and what, you know, height this, width that. Or you can go into another one that's really detailed, and people go and they count the number of species, they count the height, the width, they take lots and lots of detailed measurements. Neither are right, neither are wrong. Both would be important because they're giving you information, but equally they would both mean that the farmer, or in this case landowner, would qualify for that payment on the HRW1. The next Hedgerow action is HRW2, and this is how they're trying to get a lot of people to manage their hedgerows differently. So I'm sure you can all picture in your mind your local farmland around you and how their hedges are managed. So as I'm talking about this, try and picture that in your mind as we go on. Now, ideally, we want, just like Megan was talking about earlier on, the structural diversity. We want some tall hedges that have been let up, that have got long flowering stems and lots of acorns, lots of chestnuts or hazelnuts on them. We want young, fresh growth, where we've had a recently coppiced hedge. We want newly laid ones. We want different species. We want wide hedges. We want thin hedges. We want all of these things because it's that range of structure that will ensure the best range of habitat that's available for the range of biodiversity, and it make it more as diverse as it possibly can be. Now, the way to do this is to try and get farmers to not manage their hedges all in the same way, all at the same time, and basically making their uniform, very tidy, very neat, straight hedges. This is going to be a tricky one because many people like neat, straight, tidy hedges. And what we need to do is have slightly messier, straightish, tidy-ish hedges. And if we can convince the farmers to do that through this payment, then I do believe that we are going to get genuine biodiversity and carbon gains. Currently, well, when they announced it, it was £10 per 100 metres, but now that's just been increased to £13. And like I said, they want you to have different heights and widths. You can do the next slide. The best way of doing that is this new incremental trimming. Historically, the farmers haven't been allowed to do incremental trimming because that was deemed to be trimming every year. So if they incrementally trim, they weren't eligible for any grant. So this is quite a new thing that I think is going to be one of the key things to get our more traditional tidy farmers on board and help them qualify for this grant, but in doing so, help us improve their hedges. Historically, you know, farmers just, they don't want the hedge creeping too far into the field because they're losing grassland, they're losing area where they can grow their crops. They're not being able to drive the tractors or machinery round as much because the hedge is taking up more space. So they knock the hedges back as tight as they can. If they want to continue to receive funding, they're not going to be allowed to do that anymore. They can still manage their hedges however they want, but they just won't receive the funding for it. They've got 3 choices if they want to go for this option. They can incrementally trim, and that means that they can cut it once a year, as long as 10 centimetres away from the knuckle. So you've got an extra 10 centimetres growth out either side and up. Next year, they can trim again, another 10 centimetres. Next year, and so forth and so forth. If they do that, the hedge is getting bigger and they can receive the payment. If they don't want to trim every year, and ideally we would not want them to trim every year, then they can trim every other year. And if they're going to trim every other year, then they can only trim in January and February, which basically gives a lot of the berries chance to have been formed and birds to have found them, and really means that any trimming that takes place in that hedge isn't going to affect any late nesting birds or anything that's in the hedge kind of still in November, December. And that's becoming more and more common as our winters are getting milder and our summers getting longer. Or if you cut once every 3 years, then that's the next stage on a 2 or 3 year cycle. Or you can coppice it, like Megan was saying, cut the whole thing down, start again, completely kickstart the whole process, reinvigorate it, or you can lay it. And if you want your young hedge, your newly one, then incrementally trim it, just like the diagrams Megan was showing earlier on. And that will help the hedge to grow each year, but maintain a thicker kind of structure to it. So they will be able to qualify for HRW2 through that way. Okay, if you do the next slide. And then there's hedgerow trees. So just like we were saying, hedgerow trees are important. So there is now a scheme available, HRW3, which will reward farmers for keeping 1 tree on average on their farm per 100 metres. Now, that to me, I'm surrounded by trees and hedgerows in Devon, so 1 per 100 metres is easy peasy. I mean, it's impossible not to have a tree every 100 metres in a Devon hedge. But to me, that gives me a real indication as to how few trees there are in hedgerows elsewhere if the low ballpark target of 1 tree per 100 metres is what they're asking for. That's very, very easy to achieve. Now, if you start then thinking about if your farmer has the hedgerow survey done and they agree to, let's say, incremental cutting, and they agree to have 1 tree every 100 metres come through, they can then qualify for all 3 of those grants, which then start to stack up one on top of another. And if you think some farms are going to have 1, 2, 3 kilometres of hedgerows, you can see that financially this does start to add up. If you can do the next slide, please. If they're not, so the HRW ones are kind of like ongoing, gradual, every year maintenance or every 2 or 3 year maintenance. If the hedge needs to be revitalised or completely kick-started, or just needs a bit of a helping hand, then there are now payments for, and there always have been, but they've been recently increased considerably. There are grant payments to lay the hedges, to have them completely coppiced, to have new hedges planted, or to gap up hedges where there are gaps of 20 metres or more within an existing hedge. And all of these are available through Countryside Stewardship. Now, to qualify for these, you would need to apply for a different grant to an SFI, but they're all being blended together in a new scheme this year, which is basically going to come out in summer, but it's not live yet. But all of these are available. And if you go to the gov.uk website and just type in hedge laying in their search thing, you will find you'll be redirected to these things. And in order to qualify for any of these, the most important thing is that the farmer has their land registered with the RPA. If they don't have the land registered, they won't be able to qualify for any of the grants that are available. Okay, if you can do the next slide. So this is just about what makes a hedge. So for it to qualify as a hedge, it can't have a gap of more than 20 metres, and the gaps can't be more than 10% of the entire length. So that picture in the middle, the gaps in that one are going to be more than 10%, so that wouldn't qualify as a hedge. So what you'd probably end up doing is coppicing those stalls and replanting the entire length. That would be, a quick look at that. That would be my advice. but every hedge is different, and you can't really come up with something from a desk or an office to advise. You really need to go out and talk to the farmer, look at it, and figure out what farming things that they do and how best you can create an opportunity for the hedgerow within their farming system that isn't going to bother them to the point that they're going to not manage it properly. Okay, next slide. So, like I was saying earlier on, all of these things can all be added up. So if you can get £10, well, £13 per 100 metres per side, and £10 per 100 metres per tree, and £3 per 100 metres for the management plan, and you're managing both sides of that hedge, then you're looking, you know, 250 something, nearly £300 per 100 metres per year for 3 years. Bear in mind, they're paying either a contractor to flail it, so they would be making a saving on that cost, or they're having to use their own time to flail it. So this is a way of freeing up time for farmers. This is a way for saving money for farmers, and this is a way for increasing income for farmers, all of which are things that farmers want to hear. So I saw a question in the chat, and I'm sure we'll talk about it at the end, but these are avenues to have a conversation with farmers. If you can say you can get a grant for that, or, well, you don't have to do that every year anymore. Well, you know, go and play golf. Go and do something else instead of flailing your hedges this year. You don't have to. And tell you what, I'll get you paid to not have to do it. This is what's going to change the conversation. Yeah, I'm genuinely hopeful that these changes that are coming through this SFIs they've been properly thought about in terms of being practically achievable and actually working. There will be a genuine wildlife gain with them across the country. I'm very, very hopeful for it. If you can do the next slide. And this is just to give you an idea of what some of the payments are per metre. So the first column on the left with the numbers, that's the payment per metre for how much the grants give you. So £22.97 to plant a new hedge. That's quite a good payment rate, but you do have to bear in mind you've got to buy the plants, you've got to prepare the ground, you've got to buy the canes, you've got to buy the spiral guards, and then you've got to carry out the work. Now, if a farmer can get a group of volunteers to help plant a hedge and then claim that, then the farmer's more likely going to say yes to having a new hedge planted than if a farmer's got to pay a contractor or someone a whole load of money without getting a grant. So these grants genuinely make a conversation that can be then had with a farmer. It's an avenue, and it's something that they are going to have to hear whether they want to or not, because their financial situation is changing massively in the coming years. Yeah, next slide, please. So I'm going to hand back to Megan, and then she can finish the presentation, and then I think we're going to have a quick break and then go to the Q&A. So over to you, Megan.
Yeah, that's a brilliant overview of the SFIs. A lot of optimism in there, I think, because there's a lot of new stuff as well as stuff that people are familiar with. So there's something for everyone in there. I generally think there's an awful lot of optimism around hedges in general. Ultimately, we just want to see them bigger, better, and more joined up. I want to see them managed on a life cycle. I want to see them better understood. And I want to see more rejuvenated, because we are overdue. Most of our hedges are rejuvenation at this point. So time is ticking on them. It's going to go. So this is you won't be able to see the detail in this poster, but this is another thing that I did over lockdown when all of my other stuff got cancelled. I made a poster called A History of Hedges. And what it really is designed to do is just to show the long and exciting and occasionally turbulent history of our hedges nationwide. So we've had them, you know, in some form or other since the Bronze Age, and they've weathered some fairly interesting storms politically as well as anything else. And I think also just looking at this I think helps contextualize how much a part of the countryside they are, but also the fact that we've got the farming community to thank for them. They're a man-made and man-managed habitat, and they are only here because of the farming, the way farming has cared for them over, you know, centuries gone by. And this is just a lovely picture of a hedge, really, just for me to say that there's a lot to be optimistic about. The value of hedges has been long recognised within wildlife groups, but it hasn't been as well recognised as it now is becoming, up the scale in policy. I think politicians are cottoning on to how valuable they are. Multiple targets, all the things we've spoken about, as well as for farmers as well. It was never just about keeping the cows in, and I think a lot of farmers are now realising just what they have to gain through having good, healthy hedgerows there. We've also got the promise of the 45,000 miles of new hedgerow planting. We've got schemes coming through that are encouraging better hedgerow management, like through the SFIs. And there's more accessible advice than ever out there to actually help anyone that's wanting to do better by their hedges to go out there and actually find that information to help them do it. But I think what's also just good to keep in mind is we've got over 400,000 kilometres of hedge nationally, huge amount of hedge nationally. Most of it could do with being better looked after. Now, again, that's not a sad thing. I see that as a point of optimism. That means we've got this framework, we've got this 400,000 kilometres of hedge, which with a few tweaks to the way we manage it, can be doing almost instantly better for wildlife, better for the planet, better for us. They can very, very soon become absolute ecological dynamite. They all have that potential. So when we look at our hedgerows and we think, you know, they could be doing with a change in management or maybe, you know, something to restore them, they all have that potential within them. We have the potential to turn 400,000 kilometres of largely over-trimmed hedges into ecological dynamite, each that could have the capacity to sustain over 2,000 species. So there really is an awful lot to be optimistic about at the moment. Yeah, thank you. Oh, I think you're on mute.
Muted.
Bingo.
Thank you so much, Megan and Elliot, for that talk. It was absolutely brilliant. I've certainly learned loads. I think we're all, yeah, really inspired and enthused to go out and, yeah, see what we can do in our local parishes. But yeah, thank you so much for your time today. So I think we were going to give a quick sort of 5-minute break maybe for people maybe to get go to the toilet or get a drink or something, and then Megan and Elliot are going to be here for you to ask any questions that you have for them. And if they are both happy for you, if you think of questions after the talk, then please just email them through to me and I'll get them to Megan and Elliot, and they can reply later if that's something, you know, if you think of something after the day. Great, so maybe reconvene in about 5 minutes. Maybe I'll kick off. So Amanda's popped a question in the chat, which is, I have a heavily pruned young hawthorn hedge left to cut branches adjacent to the bottom of the hedge to create a habitat for wildlife. After listening to your trimming advice, I think I should remove these and allow the base of the hedge to grow wider. Should I remove the branches and then in brackets and burn them? With a query.
That really depends on the structure of your hedge. So if your hedge doesn't have any branching structure at the bottom, that's where it's really, really important to have shelter and branching structure at the base of your hedge. Now, the only way to get that, if the branching structure has come up and it's, you know, maybe a bit higher through its trimming regimes or something, then the only way to get it to start branching lower down really is to rejuvenate it through laying or coppicing. Now, if this isn't feasible, I don't know whether that's feasible or not, that would be my recommendation. Lay it or coppice it and then manage the regrowth incrementally up to encourage branching right from the bottom all the way to the top. If that's not feasible, then keeping branches as almost like a dead hedge at the base of your hedge is almost like the next best thing. So it's not perfect, but it's still providing that shelter that things like the nesting birds and the sheltering young mammals will need. So I would say option number 1, go for rejuvenation if you can. If you can't, then keep your sort of dead hedge branching there.
Okay. Oh, that's great. Thank you very much. I was dreading them again.
No, don't worry.
I've been so torn to pieces with these blooming hawthorn branches. So no, that's great. And another question was a hedge laying course. I was just looking for one. I think they do one on the Devon Rural Skills.
Yeah, Devon Rural Skills, the Blackdown Hills Association as well. There's quite a few. I tend to find going to the National Hedge Laying Society website, they've got a list of different hedge laying courses nationally, which you can whittle down by area. You'll find there's lots of ones that do 1 day or 2 day courses. Some do sequential weekends ones if you're really going to get into it. But yeah, they're fantastic. They're fantastic. They really give a flavour of what it's like. I mean, it can take years to become a good hedge layer, but at the end of the day, as long as you know the basic principles of how to do it, you're not going to make your hedge worse. Making sure you lay base cuts right at the bottom, not high pleaching, cutting off the heel, securing the pleaches so that they don't flap about and blow around, and making sure that they're not laid downhill. So once you've got those things really crafted, it's just practice. I'm still a terrible hedge layer. I don't make a tidy hedge ever, but I've never made a hedge worse, because knowing those core principles, it will always come back better than it was to begin with. So yeah.
Oh, great.
Go on a course and give it a go. It's a lot of fun as well.
I will. No, I will. Thank you so much. You really inspired me.
Yeah, can I just say that for anyone who is becoming obsessive about their hedges, which is brilliant, Devon Hedge Group has a really good Facebook page where you can put in any queries and very quickly get a really good conversation. So I can recommend that. Their
website also has an amazing amount of information
Brilliant.
Specific to Devon hedges, be it bank management, new Devon hedge creation, and the Devon hedge laying styles. It's one of the best websites out there, I think.
They've also got a really good book.
They do? Yes, they do.
Yes. Books now.
And it's got lots of nice pictures. But what I like about it are the pictures show the kind of technical ways of how to do different styles and how to move a bank and how to create a bank. So there's a lot of diagrams in it, and that's available via the website. It was one of the first things I bought when I moved here. It's brilliant.
So the question here from Peter, who's saying, many thanks, that was a great inspiring talk. Just wondering how farmers manage a flailing hedge cutter to set incremental year-on-year cutting to just a 10cm increase.
Yeah, well, time will tell with that one. It doesn't have to be just 10 centimeters. I mean, if you want to give it 15, 20, you can give it 15, 20. Obviously, if you're just giving it a couple of centimeters, then the die back will probably take it back to your previous cut anyway. So it does need to be, you know, a decent-ish chunk. I think time will tell. I think to begin with, it's going to be easier because you've got this quite obvious flail line already. So it'll be quite obvious where above that is. I think as time goes on, as you get less of that hard sort of textural gnarly knuckle, it's going to be less obvious, you know, where's 10 centimeters above last year, who knows. But at that point, I think we will have won because if it's not obvious where the trim line is, and if we're getting flowers and fruits on them each year, then that's basically what we're going for. So I don't think it's going to be easy. I think time will tell how well that works. And contractors are going to need to get used to it as well, because it is a new thing. But I'm optimistic. I call the incremental trimming a gateway drug to good hedgerow management, because it's easy to do. You're just doing exactly the same, but just easing off a little bit. But the rewards are almost instant. The next year you will see blossom, and that year you will see fruit. Which, I mean, the hedges around me at the moment, they get flailed to the same point every year. I don't remember the last time the ones in my village flowered. So I think when this starts to happen, it's going to be spectacular. I think it's going to be beautiful. So fingers crossed they do get that.
I think as well with what I suspect will happen is farmers that put their hedges into some of these schemes. So if we stick with incremental cutting, they will need to possibly send a photo in of the hedge each year, just one photo. Here's the hedge, original height, and look, you can see we've cut it slightly higher. No one's going to be out there with a measuring stick measuring 10 centimetres, but what they'll want to see is they'll want to see a raise, and then you'll take another photo the next year and you'll see another raise, and you'll be able to see all of those previous scar lines. It's so obvious that that photograph will basically back up the fact that the farmer has been doing what they've been claiming, and it means that the RPA or DEFRA don't need to send somebody out to go and check these schemes. It's self. We are self-gathering the evidence and self-policing. So
especially with the surveys as well, because over the years your hedges will increase in height and width, and that will be reflected in the updated hedge surveys.
Alexandra, I think you've raised your hand. Did you have a question?
So yeah, well actually I'm volunteering Toby to ask the question about
But it wasn't so much a question. I was in the pub with a couple of farmers at the weekend, and we were talking about managing their hedgerows, and they said that they've got to do it every year, otherwise it becomes too woody and it becomes dangerous for them to have to do with the flail because large bits fly off. So yeah, we were just discussing, I guess, seeing the kind of the update in terms of incremental cutting. That would be something that we could go back to them and propose to them and say, right, this is the solution. You can get those additional payments, but still cut annually if you want, or biannually, even better. So that's a good question.
There's a couple of options. So incremental trimming is one of those, because it is still cutting annually. You can do it annually and be fine. And you know, I'm in an area we've got lots of elm, and that grows really quickly, so especially because we've got quite rich soil as well. So I do understand the concerns of the 3-year trim in particular. That said, you don't have to use a flail, especially gathering these. If you're only trimming them once every 3 years, then you're only trimming a third of your hedges each year. If your contractor has something like circular saw attachment instead of a flail attachment, that will go through it a lot cleaner without the splintering and without that mess. It does mean you have to do a second sweep to collect the risings, so it's mile per mile more expensive than the flail. But if you're only doing it every 3 years, you can push that to every 5 years in some areas. Then it's cheaper in the long run, because it's more expensive each time, but it's less expensive over the course of 3, 4, 5 years.
And just on that note, does that, like, when it comes to roads, because I've seen in the chat there's been quite a lot of discussion about cutting that goes on in roads, is there sort of an assumption that this won't apply to the narrow roads? It's on the other side of the hedges, and it's allowing them to grow out where they can, and road safety is road safety.
Yeah, I mean, we know Devon lanes, there's only so much you can allow the hedge to grow into them. For safety reasons, the roadside hedges will always need to be trimmed lightly. Where you've got big banks and where you've got, you know, big verges, then maybe those ones could be considered to do incremental, if not rotational. But generally lanes are exempt really from that, because well, we've got to drive through them.
Okay, thank you.
I mean,
you can still do the top and the other side. It's just that face that faces the road that needs to be kept clear.
Yeah, and to say that, you know, if you've got, you know, you do have to cut back in most cases with the flail, the roadside of it, but if you allow the hedge to grow up, then eventually it will get to the point where you can then lay it, and that will then buy time for the farmers to then not have to do the roadside as much for those immediate few years after the hedge has been laid, because it would be putting a lot of effort into the upward growth. So, you know, I'm often laying hedges along the roadside because the farmers let the hedge grow up, because where they've been flailing it's just hollowed out underneath, and we've got deer going through, and we let the hedge grow up, lay it, fence it from the field side, and it's away again. And it suddenly you realise that actually the roads are a bit wider than they appear, and it's the hedges that are making the roads narrower, not necessarily the banks.
There's a question here from Robin, who's put, if you coppice a hedge, it's not going to be stock proof for several years. presumably a fence has to be put in. Does that make coppicing an uneconomic option?
So with so if you are getting a grant to do the laying or coppicing or planting, the DEFRA want to have the confidence that the planting is going to regenerate and it's not going to be browsed or grazed by farm livestock or potentially even wild deer. And the best way to do that is to put a fence. So if you are planting, laying or coppicing a hedge, you will automatically also qualify for another grant to then fence that hedge off. This is where, again, you can start to add these things up. And it can be done through the same grant and the same grant application. And then once you've laid it, you then just fence it off. And then basically you've got a brand new fence and you've got a brand new newly laid hedge. And you can decide how close or how far away from that hedgerow you put your new fence line. So yes, you do need to, if you're going to be doing it, you want to make sure that it's going to regenerate. Because if you actually coppice a hedgerow and you've got such deer pressure, which we have here in the Team Valley, such high deer pressure that if we coppiced a hedge and didn't fence it, that hedge wouldn't grow back, and you've actually made the situation worse. So you do need to think about what the growth possibilities are for that hedge before you start work. And
but there are other ways of dealing with that as well. So the tippy toppy bits when you've coppiced a hedge, the bits that are right at the branching stuff right at the top, the sort of low diameter, high branching bits can be placed on top of a coppice stool. As long as you don't put too much on that it's going to smother it, you can put some of that brash on top of the coppice stool to stop the deer from hammering it. It will allow those shoots to grow through unprotected, because deer don't like putting their faces in the brush. And once it's grown out from that brush, even if the deer get the tippy toppies of the new growth, that actually can sometimes improve the hedge, because again, take out the grown tips and you get bushy branching growth instead. So if fencing is an issue or not wanted in that area, then you can use it won't be cow proof, but you can use brash to help protect the regrowth from rabbits, from deer.
That's great. Cheryl, I think you've got your hand up.
Hi there. I just wanted to ask, with regards to these sort of the tabletop hedges, thinking about the slides where we had the hedges with the big gaps, sort of like with the yellow arrows. How would you go about regenerating those? Would you plant new hedges in between, or would you just lay those hedges, where hedges have been so heavily flailed that they are now sort of tabletop hedges? I'm seeing a lot. I'm in South Buckinghamshire, and I've seen a lot around recently, and I was just wondering about how you would go about regenerating them back to those awesome hedges you showed us earlier.
I would probably coppice them and replant the gaps. So if you planted the gaps without coppicing out the old stuff first, then you wouldn't be planting as close to those stems as you'd need to, or you'd plant them and the tabletop ones would overshadow the new stems you put in. So always when you're gapping up, I tend to think it's better to coppice or lay at the same time, so that your new growth and your regrowth all grows up together. And you don't have like big old gnarly thing and then a patch of young stuff and a big old gnarly thing, because that becomes a nightmare to manage afterwards as well. That said, in some places, if the gaps aren't too far, if they're close enough together, the stems, then you could get away with laying. So laying will turn each one stem into multiple stemmed bush. What it won't do is fill the gaps. It will fill the gaps temporarily by the pleachers being laid down, but what you want is growth right from the bottom. So again, Devon does lead the way, really, I think, with hedges. In Devon, when we lay our hedges, the pleachers, we cut them at the base, then we flop them right level onto the bank, because we've got wonderful hedge banks down here. And what happens then is we cast up. So we dig out some of the sediment from where the bank has collapsed, so we plonk it on top. Now what that does is this pleacher that's laid down flat onto the bank, where it touches soil, it will set new roots, and that will actually fill some of those gaps for you. Now if you're South Buckingham is, shall you say. So unfortunately, you don't have the pleasure of having banked hedges, and you probably just have lots of hawthorn ones, unfortunately, maybe. So I would say in that case, probably best to coppice what you've got and protect that regrowth and plant up the gaps, preferably with stuff that's not just hawthorn as well, because diversity is the spice of hedges.
Would that, I mean, if we're looking at sort of at those examples that you've given, those hedges look really, really old. Would a really old hedge bush, I can't think of any hedge tree, whatever you want to call it, would it survive being coppiced or laid? Because that would be my other question, is that if it's got a really, really thick stem, it's obviously very old, and you said earlier about rejuvenating it, but would they actually cope, being whatever age they are, with that stress of being coppiced or laid?
So some of them, yes, some of them, no. Unfortunately, again, hawthorn, poor hawthorn, is a little bit feeble. Once it gets past a certain point of maturity, once it's got rot right down in that base, it doesn't regrow as well. So sometimes it will, but sometimes it won't. Lots of species will regrow pretty much regardless. Hawthorn unfortunately won't. Beech is another one. Once it's got past a certain point of maturity, it doesn't really regrow from the base as well. But once you've got to that point, you don't have that many options, really. Once you've got to the point where that, I mean, a hedge that's got that old and that gnarly and that rotten at the base is way past the point where we should have rejuvenated it. We should have done it decades ago. So we don't have that much option other than potentially trimming up the sides a little bit and planting close to it so that we retain some of that old growth. Alternatively, we could trim the sides and let the existing plant grow into a hedgerow tree, plant up the gaps, and then raise the new planted stuff together. It's just when you've got old growth, new growth, old growth, new growth, old growth, new growth, it's quite difficult to manage it going forward, because ideally we want to manage it all at the same height and space within one hedge. So I think it's going to be a judgment call on those hawthorns. If they are old and really, really gnarly and rotten at the base, it might be a gamble as to whether they regrow. But there isn't much option anyway, because if they're that old and gnarly, they will likely be on the way out. And we'd need to be replanting those gaps regardless. So you could trim up the sides and plant next to them, or you could coppice them and hope for the best, or you could do a test coppice one or two of them, see how they respond, and then go in for it if they do respond well in the following year. I guess that's, yeah.
Brilliant, thank you.
Thank you very much. Is there anyone else that has a question? Or are we kind of coming to the end of the talk? I'll just double check we haven't got any on the chat.
I mean, in the chat, I saw there was a conversation about how to approach farmers. So how to take this information and to go and have a conversation. And I kind of alluded to so I work with a lot of farmers and I help them go into stewardships, and I then help them carry out the hedge laying. And fundamentally, farmers love farming, and they only love talking about farming more than they love farming. And more often than not, if you go and have a conversation with them about their land and about their farm and what they're doing, that's the first step towards working with a farmer, is to listen to them and hear them and have a conversation with them and just let them talk. Now, if that's in the pub, even better. If it's not, it might be around the kitchen table, it might be on the lane, wherever it is. Try and have a conversation with them, and don't go in with a hard sell. Don't go in with your aspirations, but just say to them, oh, I'd love, I'm really interested in wildlife and I'd love to help you because I understand how busy it is, and offer help. And the training that I think you've got on, is it next week or a couple of weeks' time at Audrey's, is going to be focusing on the hedgerow surveys.
Yeah.
And the idea is that if you as a volunteer can offer your skills, experience and enthusiasm and time to a farmer who hasn't got time, probably doesn't have the skills, probably definitely doesn't have the enthusiasm, then that's a really good offer that you can give to them to say, look, I can survey your hedges for you for free, and then you can use that to claim the grant. And then the survey will hopefully identify some advice for them. You don't have to identify what the advice is. The survey does it all for you. If you use the Healthy Hedgerows app, it prints out PDFs for you for every single hedge. It's amazing. And the advice is actually very good. Yes, it's very general, but it's written in a way that it's clearly general, but you can adapt it to that scenario. So I would really encourage you to have a little play with the app and figure that out. And suddenly, before you know it, if you're having that conversation with the landowner, before you know it, he'll be or she'll be saying, oh, well, I'm thinking of getting that one laid. Do you know anyone who can lay it? Or I'm going to lay it. Do you want to help? Or you might be saying, well, I know some people who might be able to lay it for you. And that's where it starts. And as soon as one landowner starts doing it, you can bet your bottom dollars others will start doing it. They'll see it happening. They'll say, oh, how did you get that? How much did that cost you? Well, it didn't cost me anything. One of the wildlife wardens helped me do it. And that's how it kicks off. But
that peer-to-peer is so important.
It starts with a simple conversation, and with farmers, just hear them, just listen to them, and just give them your time, because they love talking. That's the biggest thing that I've ever been taught, and it's the best avenue in when working with them. And once you've got a relationship with them, they're very, very loyal. They're really loyal people. So yeah, I'm very, very hopeful. And I'm not generally a very hopeful person, but when it comes to hedges, it is. I think it genuinely is. It's all good.
The only thing I'd add to that is also, when making those initial conversations, is go in without any judgment, because farmers get too much of that. And sometimes it's and sometimes it's not. I mean, because I talk a lot about hedges on Twitter, every single year in September I get sent photos saying, oh, look, they've obliterated this hedge. And I look at it and I'm just like, no, they've just gone through thick material that looks like it's on a 3 or 4 year trimming rotation. That's what we want. There's a lot of misconception, I think, within the general public, and there's a tendency to blame farmers for what they do, sometimes fairly, most of the time unfairly. So I think, yeah, going in without judgment of their current management practices is really very important.
Can I just chip in there, because Joe Gibson's said, will there be more hedge survey courses in future? This is for wildlife wardens, because they're both full. I'd say that if anyone hasn't managed to get onto one and wants to, perhaps if they email Vicky, if we have more than 3 people, we can probably set something up.
Yeah, that sounds good. That sounds great.
I'm really sorry, I know we're wrapping up, but I just want to pick up on something that Megan just said then about you know, seeing from the outsider what a farmer's been doing to a hedge and thinking that they've decimated it. We actually were chatting with Elliot about a hedge that's been, in our views, and quite a lot of the people locally think that it's been decimated, where they've gone along a very long stretch of hedgeline, and they've actually, with a, what would you call it, like a claw grab on the end of a digger, they've pulled out lots of hedge, like stumps of hedgerow, all the way along it, and it looks catastrophic. And is there a situation where you can see that sort of approach would be necessary, or is that and it's hard to tell?
Unlikely, unless it's things like elder, which often gets removed at point of rejuvenation. Anything that takes stuff out by the roots, unless it's elder, normally is more destructive. Mostly the comments I get about destructive is when someone's coppiced, and I get lots of people on the phone, and I have to sort of talk them through it. Okay, so is it cut to ground level, or is it ripped out? Because the two are completely different. Yeah. Has it been protected? Has it been gapped up? Okay, brilliant, that's a rejuvenation. That's actually securing the hedge's future. If it's been taken out at the roots, that's another thing. Anything that's been taken out at the roots will not grow back. Now, the only things that I would suggest that we do that with is elder, because that can become invasive within a hedge. Potentially sycamore, if you're not managing a hedge that sycamore suits, because sycamore just romps and then shades out things. It's fine if you're managing your hedge for wood fuel or something, but not necessarily if you want a mixed species hedge long term. So those two are probably the only examples I can think of where you'd actually want to take something out by the root. If they're taking out huge swathes of that hedge by the root, that would ring alarm bells for me.
Yeah, everybody's got the whole neighbourhood talking. It looks pretty catastrophic, and I would keep hoping that we're going to go along there one day and see it laid, but I don't think we're going. I don't think we're going to.
It's obvious that they've got some plan for it if they're putting the effort into going and removing stuff. But yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, thank you.
Can I also can I signpost you back to the PTES website? There's a really good poster flyer that you can download for free that you can laminate and put alongside the hedge, and it explains why have I copied this, why have I laid it, what does this do, and you know, print it out and give it to your farmer and go, here you go, I thought you might want this because people might complain, but actually it's preempting complaints is a hell of a lot easier than dealing with them.
I made that because so many farmers told me that one of the legitimate barriers that they have of rejuvenating their hedges is public perception. Because I've had hedge layers called ecological terrorists or creating, what is it, scorched earth tactics, or so many things that you just think, actually, with a little bit of knowledge and understanding, people would understand that this is a regenerative process, a rejuvenation practice. It looks destructive. And a lot of farmers are put off doing these things because public perception can get it wrong, and they can get criticized for it. So that's why I made that poster. Yeah.
Where would we find that poster again? I've got protected. Could you tell me what I should Google to find that poster?
I'll tell you what, I will find the link now and post it, because I can't remember exactly where it is.
Alexandra, whereabouts are you? Where is this hedge that is
well, we're don't judge us too harshly, but we're over the border in Cornwall.
we don't.
No, but
it's a hedge, not a hedgerow.
We used to be part of Devon, but we are now officially Cornwall. We're in North Petherwin, so about 10-15 minutes north of Launceston.
Yeah. Okay.
Whereabouts are you, Audrey?
We're in the Tean Valley, not far from Elliot, not far from the A38, not far from Chudley.
Yeah, okay, cool.
Fabulous, absolutely fabulous, but so's Cornwall.
Cool.
Right, I've posted
I would say that I've seen a lot of hedges this year which have been shape sawed to the ground, and although I agree with Megan that it's rejuvenating them, I think that the very great lengths that have been done in one job again have a catastrophic effect on some of the birds, because if you're going to do literally 3/4 of a mile of hedge, that is going to be too much in one go, and what people should be doing is
for a coppice we recommend no more than 5% in any one year.
Yeah, so we definitely think even if they're doing a regenerative process, they've definitely done too much in one go. They've done a very long stretch, and that I always forget the birds that were in that stretch. What were they called?
Chaffinch and bramblings.
Chaffinch and bramblings, all along there in really, really big numbers. And now there's just nowhere for them to go. So that's been quite upsetting. And the irony is they've had birdseed in the field behind it for the last couple of years, and then decimated the hedgerow. It's a real shame.
So there is a balance to be struck with this about how much you do in one go and whether you stagger it. I would say no more than 5% coppice in any one year, because you do not want to be taking all of that out at once. But when you're looking at an individual stretch of hedgerow, there is a debate to be had as to whether you take that hedgerow out in one go, or whether you do that in sections, maybe thirds or quarters or half. And that really depends on what you've got around you. You can't look at this on a hedge by hedge basis. You have to look at the surrounding hedges and work out what's most valuable. Because if you're looking at connectivity, if you take it all out in one go, it will grow back in one go, and you've lost 1 year of connectivity. If you're looking at if you divide it into 4 and coppice that hedge over 4 years, you've got 4 years where that's no longer providing connectivity, because you'll have 4 years where that hedge has got gappy. So if connectivity is something that is important in that particular area, then doing it all in once, one hedge by hedge, not multiple hedges, might be better, as long as the surrounding hedges have been managed to accommodate that. So if the hedges around it are short and don't provide the nesting or the food, then previous years you should let those up, make sure that you've accommodated for that loss in the surrounding area. However, having said this, there is no advice at the moment about all of this. So I've been trying for the last 3 years to write a piece of advice to how to do these decisions, how to create a farm scale management plan that considers connectivity, nesting, food aspect, all of these things. And it's nigh on impossible to actually get that advice out there. So a lot of people are working on this without actually having advice about how to do it. So it is something I'm still plugging away at, and I'm hoping by the end of this year I will have a document that can actually help. But sometimes what I would say is removing an entire hedge sometimes is the best option. There's just a few things that can be done to mitigate the short-term sort of displacement of resources that it will create. And when we're looking at hedges like that, it always feels like emotionally, every time I'm looking at a hedge to coppice or something, it's an emotional, like, wow, but look at all the berries on it, look at all the nesting, look at all of this. But what you've got to do is you've got to set your mind to thinking, well, what will this look like in 20 years time if I don't? It won't have as many stems in it, so not as much will rejuvenate, and it will become worse and worse and worse over time. So if we want them there in the long term, we do need to do those fairly, like, emotionally hard for people with a conservation mind practice of properly let's just go for it and take them out. But again, it has to be done in stages. It has to be done sensitively and considering all of these things, looking around, seeing what else is there, and working out whether the habitat, whether the nesting, whether the food, or whether the connectivity is the limiting factor in the area, and working towards that.
Brilliant, really good answer. Thank you, Megan.
That's okay.
Thank you. Is that everyone happy and satisfied with all that wonderful knowledge that we've got to digest? Thank you so much, Megan and Elliot. It's been really, really wonderful. We really, really appreciate your time this evening. Elliot and Megan have both given their time freely to give this talk to us. I have put it out there that they have asked if people are able to or would like to give a small donation to the Wildlife Warden Scheme. We run on a real shoestring, and anything is very, very much appreciated to keep this wonderful network going. But yeah, we very, very much appreciate Elliot and Megan for the talk this evening. It's been great. Thank you very much.
Could you put the link to the Wildlife Wardens scheme in the chat box?
Yes, of course I can. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. And thank you very much. It's been really, really interesting.
Oh, thanks all for listening.
Thank you, Elliot and Megan. That was fabulous.
Yeah.
Thank you.